You can see from the fact this paper kind of has three titles that I was in some uncertainty as to exactly what to call it. And you'll probably hear as I speak that I'm in some uncertainty about exactly what it is I'm doing in this talk. So I hope you'll be indulgent and bear with me. It goes off, especially towards the end, in a direction that's a little unfamiliar to me. I have an epigraph from Derrida, which, as it happens, is invoking Benjamin, in which Derrida says, "The impossible task of the translator, that's what deconstruction also means." The angel I refer to in my subtitle is, of course, the translator, more specifically me. 30 years ago or so, after my second sustained translation effort, the first was on Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, which would be another story entirely. My second sustained translation effort on Derrida's book, Truth in Painting, in which I worked with my old friend Ian MacLeod, I was struck by the noble and charitable nature of the conventional view of the task of the translator, which in the translator's preface to that volume, which the University of Chicago Press would not allow me to entitle Tr-Mod, which was my original intention, we described that nature of the task of the translator as saintly. Here I was with a text I was quite capable of reading in the original language, this being in principle, of course, an ability translators are presumed to have, though it seems they don't always, in fact, have. Here I was spending hours of really badly paid labour. I calculated at the end of the process of drafts, comments on draft, discussions, arguments, retyping, corrections, that I would have earned easily more money cleaning windows than I earned translating The Truth in Painting. Here I was spending hours of really badly paid labour to produce something of which, in principle, I had no use myself. I had no need for this translation. And which was, moreover, literally a rather thankless task in assuming that the work was done at all competently. All that would stand out in the translated text would be its errors and infelicities. Only a saint, or perhaps an idiot, I thought at the time, would take on such a task. Or as we might venture to say in French, faut être bête. You have to be stupid. You have to be a fool. Now I think that the translator isn't merely a saint and is rather more an angel. Not just because of his or her good but apparently slightly stupid nature, but by the very function of translation itself. Angel, angelos, is notoriously enough a messenger, a go-between, a mediator, a mailman, a transmitter or bringer of the word. Like the angel, the translator does not author the text he or she brings, but delivers it to a reader who, without this angelic intervention, would have no access to the word. The angel is not the author of the word, but its bearer or deliverer, the one who gives it to be read, the one who opens the book, and in so doing reveals something. In the Bible, over a quarter of the 200 or so references to angels occur in the book of Revelations. So the angel in the subtitle of this talk is the translator. The beast is, of course, the text. For example, the text or texts translated under the title The Beast and the Sovereign. Perhaps not by accident, this is a text in which Derrida speaks not only about beasts and sovereigns, but also about angels. For example, near the beginning of the second session of the first year of the seminar, in a context where Derrida is unfolding the possibilities afforded by the homophony in French between the words et, meaning and et, meaning is, so that la bête et le souverain, usually understood as the beast and the sovereign, can also be heard as la bête et le souverain, the beast is the sovereign. In that context, Derrida is led to say, le souverain n'est pas un ange, mais dirait-on, qui fait le souverain fait la bête. So the sovereign is not an angel, but, one would say, who plays the sovereign plays the beast. Or who acts the sovereign acts the beast. I don't know what the translator put for that. Which formulation calls for a helpful note from the translator, who points out that a French listener or reader would immediately make the connection with a famous pensée of Blaise Pascal, which reads as follows: L'homme n'est ni ange ni bête, et le malheur veut que qui veut faire l'ange fait la bête. So man is neither angel nor beast, and the misfortune is that whoever plays the angel plays the beast, or whoever acts the angel acts the beast. And perhaps unconsciously, Derrida circles back to that idiom much later in session 7, discussing Valéry's Monsieur Test, and the claim that the eponymous character of that work has killed the marionette in himself. Derrida says the paradoxical effect of this duel with the marionette is that it can transform the winner or the victor himself into a machine who wants to act the angel and therefore acts the beast. End of quote. I really want to be an angel, and I turned out to be a stupid beast. Or rather, apparently, a machine who wanted to be an angel, who turned out to be a stupid beast. I will call that machine Google Translate. As is well known, Martin Heidegger, who was certainly no angel himself, and who I think talks only rarely about angels, Martin Heidegger, thinking about the question of truth, typically appeals to the Greek term that my Greek friends pronounce aletheia as potentially providing access to an experience of truth that's more originary or primordial than that provided by the later Greek term homoiosis, by the Latin term veritas, or by other more modern terms, including the German Wahrheit, all of which, according to Heidegger, bring values or associations of adequation, certainty, and correctness. That more primordial truth, aletheia, is to be found in an experience of uncovering, unconcealment, or deconcealment, as is supposedly signalled by the morphology of the Greek word itself. Aletheia is marked, according to Heidegger, by its initial alpha privativum. So the prefix a is a privative prefix. So it's marked as alethi, non-forgetting, we might assume. Except that, as Heidegger also often stresses, the primordial sense of lethe is not to do directly with forgetting, but precisely with hiddenness or concealment. And it's only when aletheia weakens, as Heidegger puts it, without really explaining how that comes to happen, only when aletheia weakens and stops being the counter-concept to lethe and instead becomes opposed to the concept of pseudos, of falsity, of false opinion and deceptive assertion. This is something I talked about at length last year. And is thus essentially defined as an issue for constative or apophantic language. It's only then that the drift towards the more modern conceptions of truth begins. This is very basic Heidegger. In an important subsection of section 44 of Being and Time, Heidegger suggests that even translating the Greek word aletheia as truth, as Wahrheit, is liable to be misleading. He says this: thus unconcealment, aletheia, belongs to the logos. To translate this word as truth, so here's the truth in translation, to translate this word as truth, and especially to define this expression conceptually in theoretical ways, is to cover over the meaning of what the Greeks posited at the basis of the terminological use of aletheia. Now, in Being and Time itself, Heidegger doesn't dwell at all on this question of translation. This is a passing remark. Nor does he even make explicit the claim about reading the word aletheia as having an initial alpha privativum, though he does hyphenate it in Being and Time. But this is something to which he returns again and again in published work and courses throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s and beyond. For example, in a famous 1942 course, nominally at least devoted to Parmenides, Heidegger first claims that whereas the word truth, so the word Wahrheit, and I'm quoting him, does not give us anything to think, and still less anything to represent intuitively, whereas the word Wahrheit is characterized like that, if we follow what he calls the directive provided by the translating word unconcealedness, so Unverborgenheit, this appeals to us immediately, he says, even if we still have to do some further thinking to figure out what exactly is given in that appeal. It's actually in another course given in the immediately preceding semester in 1942, again nominally at least devoted to Hölderlin's hymn Der Ister. It's in that course that Heidegger offers some of his most sustained reflections on translation in general. When translating, he says, do not place undue faith in the dictionary, the Wörterbuch. The dictionary may well be correct in its definitions, and that correctness may be what we need when we think of language merely as a vehicle or a technique of communication and exchange, but it's of little use if we're interested, as Heidegger wants us to be, in the essential realm named in the word or the historical spirit of a language as a whole. This limitation of the usefulness of the dictionary holds true for translation. I'm quoting again, because every translation must necessarily accomplish the transition from the spirit of one language into that of another. End of quote. This is necessary because otherwise translation would simply be impossible. The dictionary-based correct technical communicational vehicle view of exchange language, the dictionary-based correct technical communicational vehicle of exchange view of language, which he elsewhere calls the external and technico-philological view of language, he says in fact makes translation impossible, or at least does not constitute translation. Quoting, there is no such thing as translation if we mean that a word from one language could, or even should, be made to substitute as the equivalent of a word from another language. End of quote. For Heidegger, of course, this impossibility of word-for-word translation doesn't mean that translation is to be devalued, but rather generalized, because translation can also bring out hidden connections in the source language, in the language being translated. And this, according to Heidegger, shows that all translation is interpretation, auslegen, Auslegung, and indeed, and now he generalizes the concept of translation. Not only all translation is interpretation, but in return all interpretation is translation. And this means that even interpreting Hölderlin in German, but not just Hölderlin, also Kant or Hegel, the other examples he gives, even interpreting Hölderlin in German without any translation in the normal sense, nonetheless involves translating, which shows that such works, Hölderlin, Kant, Hegel, are essentially in need of translation. And then he says this, simplifying and cutting the quotes. It's difficult to quote Heidegger in short bits. There's a much longer reflection of which this is a kind of summary. This interim remark about the essence of translation is meant to recall that the difficulty of translation is never merely a technical issue. That's my emphasis, but concerns the relation of human beings to the essence of the word and to the worthiness of language, or perhaps the dignity of language, or Würde der Sprache. Tell me what you think of translation, and I will tell you who you are, writes Heidegger. Tell me what you think of translation, and I will tell you who you are. And this is part of a still broader claim, which is spurred by reflection on Hölderlin's relation to the Greeks and to the Greek language, namely that becoming homely, as the translation puts it, becoming heimisch, always involves what the English translation of Heidegger's course rather modestly calls an encounter with the foreign, an Auseinandersetzung. It's a word that involves an element of strife or conflict, of standoff or argument or différend, a having it out with. Auseinandersetzung is a word which my friend Google translates as confrontation rather than simply encounter. So becoming homely essentially involves an Auseinandersetzung that involves this moment of confrontation with the foreign, and therefore a moment of translation. Now, although Heidegger here does explicitly relate this claim to the historical context in which he's delivering his lectures, explicitly referencing the entry of the United States into the Second World War, which on Heidegger's reading precisely does not qualify either as translation or historical encounter with the foreign, but rather an attempt to annihilate the very possibility of history, foreignness, and translation. So although Heidegger relates this claim to this specific historical context, we might be tempted to say more formally that on this construal of translation, the same can come to itself as itself only via this more or less violent encounter with the foreign. Here, at any rate, is how Heidegger draws these threads together in the review, the Wiederholung, or the repetition that always often helpfully punctuate Heidegger's lecture course. Here too I've cut a longer quote to keep things relatively simple. Genuine translation is always an encounter, so Auseinandersetzung, and thus has its own possibilities and limits. Every translation is interpretation, and all interpreting is a translating. To the extent that we have the need to interpret works of poetry and of thought in our own language, it's clear that each historical language is in and of itself in need of translation, and not merely in relation to foreign languages. This indicates in turn that a historical people is not of its own accord, that is, not without its own intervention at home in its own language. It may therefore be that we speak German, yet talk entirely American. On this basis and the basis of other similar remarks, this again is part of a longer development where Heidegger refers somewhat dismissively to what he calls Englisch-Amerikanisch, with a hyphen, English-American, American-English, I guess, it's lumped together. So on this basis, it seems as though it's going to be difficult for the encounter between German and English, or English-American, to have the same kind of Auseinandersetzung virtue that the encounter of German and Greek can hope to have, because English is already on the way to becoming American, and American carries with it essentially the technical communicational view of translation that is the negation of true translation, in which the encounter with the foreign is always still part of a homecoming. So if you like, translating German, and in this case Heidegger, from or into English-American is intrinsically the negation rather than the translation of German, an interruption of the becoming Heimisch that true translation is supposed to provide. So I'm guessing this is why in the preface to the English translation of Heidegger's course on Hölderlin, the Anglo-American translation team, translated by a Brit and an American, they talk at some length about the difficulty of translating these passages about translation, but they never mention the possibility of there being anything specific about the fact that they're translating his German into English-American. It's as if it was just one language among others into which one might translate Heidegger. And by Heidegger's own lights, in the very text they're translating, it has this special standing as a language into which, or with respect to which, translation in the strong sense simply cannot happen. So I guess you could have some sympathy with them not mentioning that problem in their introduction. Another way of putting this would be to say that a translating of German into American always might not come home again. And this non-return, potential non-return, threatens the very homeland itself. If we're not careful, says Heidegger, we might speak German but talk American, and indeed we may already be doing so. And insofar as this is true of America, then America as such just names the techno-nihilistic extension or exacerbation of the drift of truth away from the originary Greek experience of aletheia, unconcealedness or deconcealment, via Latin veritas, to mere accuracy and calculative technique, a kind of end of history, as the thoroughgoing technico-calculative negation of historicity, the epitome of what Heidegger's Beiträge called gigantism and machination, and tendentially the end of the possibility, however tenuous, of retrieving some new inception from the Greek origin, an end of history that is here embodied in the Anglo-American technical dictionary view of translation that Heidegger is arguing against. For short, I'll call this view that Heidegger is denouncing Google Translate, which might even be technical and nihilistic beyond what Heidegger could ever have imagined, in that, if I understand correctly, Google Translate most often goes via English-American to translate other languages among themselves. It has an intermediate stop in English-American before leaving for the target language. I also think I really can't explain why this would possibly be the case, that Google Translate doesn't handle ancient Greek yet. I impatiently wait for that day. So it's precisely against this view of translation, the English-American dictionary technico-calculative Google Translate view, which would very happily render Aletheia as Wahrheit and truth, even in modern Greek. That's how Aletheia gets translated by Google. That view of translation, that Heidegger, in the spirit of the Auseinandersetzung, is proposing his understanding of Aletheia as Unverborgenheit, unconcealment or deconcealment. So, one wonders what might happen to Heidegger's understanding of truth and translation, and thereby his understanding of translation in general, and all it brings with it, if it were to turn out that he were wrong about the etymology and morphology of the word aletheia. Heidegger's claim, remember, is that prior to its philosophical Platonico-Aristotelian fixing in relation to the belated counter-concept pseudos, aletheia named a primordial Greek experience marked by an internal strife or struggle against concealment or lethe, that struggle or strife being marked by that supposed alpha privativum at the beginning of the word, aletheia. But Heidegger's influential and, of course, very familiar interpretation was, in fact, quite vigorously contested in 1954 by the German classical scholar Paul Friedländer. No relation to Saul Friedländer, if you were wondering. Contested in a short chapter. It's less than 3,000 words. It's actually shorter than this talk, I think. Entitled Aletheia, and confidently subtitled, at least in this first version, Eine Auseinandersetzung mit Martin Heidegger. So a confrontation with Martin Heidegger. This is a chapter that's added to the second edition, 1954, of a work on Plato that Friedländer had originally published in its first edition in 1928 and subsequently had published in English-American translation, but translated in fact by a German scholar, Hans Meyerhoff. So published in English-American translation in 1958, for which it was already revised a little, and further revised again in the second German edition of 1964, and yet again in the second English edition of 1968, perhaps 1969, just about the time of Friedländer's death. There's simply no philological evidence, says Friedländer in this first, most confident version of his chapter. There's simply no philological evidence to support Heidegger's claim about the alpha privativum interpretation of aletheia, even the earliest of the early Greeks, according to Friedländer, who quotes Hesiod and Homer. Even the earliest of the early Greeks already understood aletheia essentially as accuracy of speech rather than deconcealment of being. Now, this issue has led to a certain amount of academic commentary among the Heideggerians, and to some extent among the Platonists, but such commentary typically does not point out that there's a good deal of poignancy, to say the very least, and for want of a better word, in the circumstances of Friedländer's claim, or as I guess I'll call it, Friedländer's case. This is where I start wandering into unfamiliar territory for me. Poignancy about the circumstances of this claim. Friedländer, who was 6 or 7 years older than Heidegger, had in fact been Heidegger's colleague and indeed his friend at the University of Marburg for 5 years in the 1920s. They both attended the theologian Rudolf Bultmann's Greek reading group, at which Heidegger apparently embarrassed everybody by roaring with laughter at the dirty jokes in Aristophanes. They took country walks together. They seem to have fought over their common student Hans-Georg Gadamer, in a sequence from which Heidegger not unusually emerges looking pretty shabby. And Friedländer had indeed published the first edition of his magnum opus on Plato in 1928, just 1 year after the publication of Being and Time. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be less interested in the detail of Friedländer's critique, which is intricate and painstaking, and his progressive recognition through these different German and English editions, German and American editions, I should say, of his book, and in the light of scholarly work by several much younger classical philologists, many of whom sided with Heidegger. So I'm less interested in the detail of that critique and his progressive recognition that he is in fact quite radically mistaken in the details of his claims about Aletheia. I'm less interested in that today and more interested in the circumstances of that critique. So in 1935, Friedländer, who was Jewish, was by then teaching at the university in Halle, was forced to resign on racial grounds by the Nazis. He was subsequently imprisoned for about 6 weeks in 1938 in the camp at Sachsenhausen, which was not yet at that time a death camp, but still. He managed, with the help of Rudolf Bultmann, the theologian, to be released, and subsequently, with many complex details, he managed to emigrate in 1939 to the US, where he taught first for a year at Johns Hopkins and then for around 10 years at UCLA before retirement in 1949. He then lived a kind of self-imposed exile in Los Angeles, city of the angels, therefore of translators, if you think as I do that translators are angels. And in fact, the original version of this talk was written to be delivered in Los Angeles. He carried on living there. He did not return to Germany. He lived there until his death in December 1968. So I'm going to say that Friedländer was translated to America and never returned home. And even though he progressively, and in some ways this is a rather pathetic experience to read the sequence of versions of this chapter where Friedländer progressively abandons his claims against Heidegger without exactly wanting to admit ever that Heidegger is right. Nonetheless, he doesn't give up. At age 83, in 1966, for example, Friedländer writes a letter to Heidegger. I have no idea if this letter was ever sent or received. All I have is a typed extract from it, typed and handwritten extract from it, that is among the Friedländer papers at UCLA. Friedländer is 83. He started his Aletheia chapter by saying, Heidegger's influential interpretations of Aletheia and Logos influenced a whole generation. And in the chapter, he takes on the Aletheia interpretation, attacks it, and then progressively abandons the attack. Logos he doesn't mention again in the chapter. In 1966, he's still at it. If you see the detail of this letter, he's basically saying, you are so wrong about Logos. It never means, right? Legein never means legen. This never means that. This has never anything to do with that. It's a completely impenitent and persistent attempt to follow through with the failed critique of the Aletheia interpretation. As I say, Friedländer is 83 years old. He's not in great shape. He's not very happy to be in exile, in self-imposed exile into Los Angeles. This is part of the circumstances that I'm talking about. And these circumstances, about which I could say a great deal more, communicate with what may be the most important point for me here today. Heidegger's quick dismissal of America and all that it stands for, absence of history, absence of language, absence of philosophy, is put under pressure perhaps less by Friedländer's explicit arguments than by broader technological possibilities that from Heidegger's perspective flow from the same, of course ultimately European and metaphysical, technological roots as Anglo-American talk in general, and the mistaken view of translation in particular that I've been calling Google translate. So what Heidegger later called the machinery of communication, which developed into the overarching sway of cybernetics. I'm not going to read those quotes, but it gives you a sense of things Heidegger was writing in the early 60s. The overarching sway of cybernetics, which we might reasonably want to claim is American through and through, and indeed intimately related to that entry of America into the Second World War, which Heidegger could see only as a negation of history and of Europe itself. Cybernetics, of course, famously developed by Norbert Wiener, himself the child of German Jewish immigrants to America, even though himself a left liberal thinker who was initially involved in the American war effort and then subsequently had doubts about the danger of nuclear weapons and the relation they could possibly have to his cybernetic project. So what Heidegger later called the machinery of communication developed into the overarching sway of cybernetics is clearly now taken further than Heidegger, or indeed cybernetics itself, could have imagined by everything that was opened up by digital technologies, personal computing, and especially the internet. And what I'm able to present as to the circumstances of the Friedländer case was essentially made possible by just those technologies. So my ability, with a really quite modest expenditure of time and money, to marshal these materials so rapidly, to sift them for relevant passages, to display some of them for you here. I'll show you a couple more in a minute. Crucially relied on search engines, on optical character recognition, on Google Translate even, and on other features of the internet that I think do more than simply make scholarship easier or partake of what is increasingly called the digital humanities. These features are essentially and radically changing the nature of scholarship in ways that I think we deplore at our peril, but that are clearly enough part and parcel of everything that Heidegger is denouncing under the name America. Let me just show you some documents that I was able to retrieve from my desk at home in Atlanta, Georgia, occasionally with some modest expenditure of time and money. But this, for example, is Paul Friedländer's birth certificate from 1882 in Berlin, available in very nice high definition. This image doesn't quite do justice to the possibilities that are available from the Berlin archives. You see there are many different types of script. We could say quite a bit about each of them. I'll say a little bit about the rubber stamped text in a second. This is Friedländer's marriage certificate, equally available. One of the nice things about this document, from my point of view, is what I call the différence effect, in the Derridian spirit, where, as you know, in French, différence spelt with an A is pronounced exactly the same as différence spelt with an E. Derrida puts to good effect. You'll see that Friedländer, A with an umlaut, married a woman whose maiden name is Charlotte, she's French, Friedländer. Friedländer, however, as is not reflected here with an AE diphthong ligature. So pronounced the same. Here we are. This is her married name, Friedländer with an umlaut. This is her maiden name, Friedländer, pronounced exactly the same but with an AE ligature. And in fact, she's French. But Friedländer and Friedländer, it's a différence effect in this document. This is an instantiation of how pedantic Friedländer must have been about that very issue. This is the manifest, part of the manifest of the boat on which he arrived in New York with his wife and daughter in 1939. And if I zoom in on the relevant line, which you can see right back here, I hope this will show up. You can see that originally on the manifest it was the AE version. It's been pedantically changed to the umlaut version. So I imagine Paul Friedländer, who was a very precise man, in its philological detail, did not want his name to appear spelt incorrectly on the manifest of the boat, the name of which I now, I'm afraid, forget, but arrived in, I think, August 1939 in the harbour in New York. This is back to the birth certificate, just so I could say a word or two about what's in the margin here. It's rubber stamped and partially filled in by hand text. This is the top Gothic script. Notice the transition from Gothic script to non-Gothic script in this one. I'll show a clearer version of this rubber stamp in a second. This is reflecting a law passed on the 17th of August 1938 that obliged all German Jews whose names were not immediately obviously Jewish to adopt new forenames. So all German Jewish men whose name was not immediately obviously Jewish were renamed by this law in August 1938. And although it's very hard to read what this is because of the very strange handwriting that you may have also picked up in the rest of some of these documents, is Israel. So Paul Friedländer for a while was called Israel. You can check out the script and make some sense of the funny handwriting by visiting this website that allows you to type in Paul and Israel, and it gives a rough version of what you saw in the script up here. I think it's called the Zitterlin script, which was in wide use in the early part of the 20th century in Germany. This one is actually from the birth certificate of Friedländer's slightly older brother. You see it's dated 1880. I just include that because this becomes a little bit more legible. This rubber stamp is the official cancellation of this one. So the law of 1938 renamed male children, this one to, let's see, it's included in the stamp this time, This one dated 1952. But that's only when the stamp is put in, because the law is from 20th September 1945. It's the four powers occupying Germany who immediately rescinded retrospectively the law that's reflected in the top one. And so the changed name, or the changing of the name, is henceforth invalid. So Friedländer is officially renamed Paul by that document. Just to give you a taste of some of the documents that are really quite readily available and that illuminate, I think, the Friedländer case from this perspective of technological developments. So my suggestion, in conclusion, is that the Friedländer case, much more than Friedländer's argument, because he does, after all, wind up admitting that he's quite wrong about the philology. Friedländer's case, which brings what he calls his contribution to civilization to America. This is the language that Friedländer uses when he applies in 1938 to the Emergency Committee in aid of displaced foreign scholars, making a case to be allowed to emigrate to the US. It wasn't a simple matter. So I want to say that Friedländer, bringing his contribution to civilization to America, also in spite of himself, I think almost certainly in spite of himself, I don't know that he would have liked Google any more than Heidegger did, brings America to civilization in return, in a way that Heidegger, for one, can only interpret in apocalyptic terms as the denial of historicity altogether, the radical failure of the decision for a new inception, and even the failure of the possibility of decision as such. So like it or not, and I'm guessing Friedländer didn't really or exactly like it, in going to the extreme edge of the land of the gigantic and of machination, close to the movies but far from a good library, Friedländer is part of a process that engages not only the triumph of what we now sometimes call neoliberalism, but also an inexorable digitization, virtualization, and synthesization of the world, whereby, among many other things, we can now look in hyperreal detail at documents that Paul Friedländer, who never went home to Germany, whose translation never returned to the Heimischkeit the Auseinandersetzung was supposed to promote, documents that he certainly never saw in their current form. This definitely involves translation of a sort, in fact translations of all sorts, but not, one imagines, quite of the sort that Heidegger had in mind when he said, translated into what I now propose to call here with the angels, not English Amerikanisch, but Engelisch Amerikanisch, when Heidegger said, tell me what you think of translation and I will tell you who you are. The stupid, angelic translating machine angel within me, my little inner Google Translate, wants to claim that there can be no essential difference between translation reckoned technically and translation seen as Auseinandersetzung, but that there is always, in fact, translation between these two ways of thinking about translation, and therefore between language thought as radical technicity and language thought as what Heidegger elsewhere calls, poetically, a concealed shrine. Thank you.